morning. If you would, take your Bibles and open them up to the book of Daniel. It's where we'll start today. It's not where we'll stay, but we will be starting in Daniel today. On November the 8th of this month, or this year, we have the opportunity to elect a president, 435 members of the House of Representatives, and roughly 33 senators, and a whole host of local officials and state officials. And when we think about the magnitude of what that means, is it's really a blessing to live in a country where we have that opportunity. Could you imagine living in an area, in a country where you're forced to serve under a dictator, or you're forced to serve under somebody who is, ruthless or unbelievably wicked? We think that our choices sometimes are not real good, but we do have a blessing living in a country, because as Christians, we have the ability to influence our government for good, like what Bill had mentioned in his prayer. We have that ability, and sometimes we feel like our voices are not heard. Sometimes we feel like we're just kind of throwing our hands up in the air and what am I supposed to do? But we do have the opportunity to influence in some manner. Sometimes where the candidate we're supporting is they win, and that's great. And sometimes the candidate we support, they don't win, and that's okay too. Sometimes we may be in a situation where we don't like any of the candidates, and that's the way it goes sometimes. But some people, they really get involved in the emotions that are sometimes tied to politics, and if your candidate wins, sometimes your emotions kind of boil over, and you're just excited, and if your candidate loses, sometimes it's like maybe it's the end of the world in your mind or something. But that's the way that it works. And this morning, I'm not here to talk about who you should vote for. That's not my goal. That's not what I want to do. You're mature enough and you're informed enough where you can look and see who supports what and make an informed decision. But I want to talk about this morning whether our preferred candidate wins or loses, whatever your politics are. As a Christian, we need to remember that there are some principles that we need to apply to our lives, and remember, as we're living among the nations of the world, that there are some things that we can remember to help us to get through each election cycle. The first thing we want to remember is that when the election's over, on November the 9th, what happens? First thing is we need to remember that we need to renew our trust in God's sovereignty. When we think about God's sovereignty, the word sovereignty is just simply in control. You don't have to answer to anybody else. And if you're a sovereign nation like the United States is, we don't have a higher authority in the world to answer to. That's the way God is. God is a sovereign ruler. And God is ultimately in control no matter who wins the election. Now look at Daniel chapter 2, beginning at verse 20. We'll look at a couple of passages in Daniel just to kind of confirm what's being said here. But Daniel chapter 2, verses 20 through 23. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers, that you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand." In this particular passage, Daniel's talking to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And Daniel is reaffirming to Nebuchadnezzar that the only reason you're the king of Babylon is because God put you there. So Nebuchadnezzar's having to have this reminded to him, and of course, it's in the context of interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but Daniel is making sure Nebuchadnezzar understands that it's God who puts him in control. Now flip over to chapter 4. We're going to read verse 17 and then verses 34 and 35. Verse 17 says, "This decision is by the decree of the watchers and the sentence of the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, who gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. And then a couple verses later, 34 and 35, and at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So as we're looking at the election, and however it turns out, whoever your candidate is, whoever you're supporting, whether for president or any of the other elections, we can influence those, but ultimately God is the one who controls who is there and who's not there. And Paul talks about this as well. Flip over to Romans chapter 13. And I know you're familiar with the passage, but we want to look at it just to kind of remind us what Paul is talking about in the book of Romans. Romans chapter 13, we'll read 1 through 5. Or 1 through 4, I'm sorry. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. We could stop right there because that tells us exactly where this authority, whoever is in control, gets their authority. They're from God. They get their power from God. Verse 2, therefore whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So, again, Paul is reaffirming what Daniel had just said. It's because of God wanted these people to be in control, why they're in control. The government itself is there for to be used as God's minister to do good and to punish evil, and that's kind of the function. And Jesus even reaffirms that he's in control. Matthew chapter 28, he says, all authority is given to me in heaven. We recognize that, but also on earth. The authority is in God's control. It's God's sovereignty as to why things happen the way that they do. Now, we do have influence over those things, but just remember, God is sovereign. And because God is sovereign, we need to trust in his sovereignty. Look at Romans chapter 8. Back up a couple of pages. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Paul is writing here. He says, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So when I'm reading this verse here, and if we're a supporter of one candidate, and that candidate may be turning out to be a tyrant, letting all kind of things that are ungodly come into this nation, and just, you can kind of lay out the picture of how bad things could be if, whenever the government takes the wrong direction. But what does this verse say? All things work together for good for those who love God. It'll work out in some form or fashion to those who are Christians. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but I can remember and think about as I read back through the book of Acts, who's in control of the world when Paul was doing all his mission work? The Roman government was probably the most corrupt, horrible, awful government you could possibly have in the history of the world. And things worked out for Paul. Things worked out for the early church. Things worked out. The church grew and it multiplied and expanded because God is in control. Go on down to verses 31 through 34. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Again, right there. If our candidate is not the one who wins, it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. If we're with God, they can do whatever they want to do. God is still going to be for us. We're going to be supported. We're going to be okay. Verse 32. And who did not spare his own son, but he delivered him up for all of us, how shall he not with him also, who also freely gave us all things? Who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died, and furthermore is also risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. So, God is for us. We can't be separated from that. Verse 35, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? You could even put in there, or the government, or whatever. There's nothing that can separate you from God unless you separate yourself from God. So whoever wins the election, we need to remember to trust in the sovereignty of God. Point number 2. We need to reaffirm our heavenly citizenship. We as people here are blessed beyond measure being citizens of the United States. It's, I was born here, you were born here, but think about all the people who flocked to this country just to be a part of what we have. We're really blessed to be citizens of this country, but really, in reality, if you're a Christian, your citizenship is not the United States of America. Your citizenship is in heaven. Look at Philippians chapter 3, verse 20. Paul says, for our citizenship is in heaven, from which we also eagerly wait for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Paul's talking to Christians here. He's talking to members, people who are from the city of Philippi. And the city of Philippi is part of the Roman Empire, who they were citizens of Rome, but Paul is telling them, he's reminding them, Rome is good, and Rome, it's good to have that citizenship, but what really are you? You're a Christian. And your citizenship is not Rome. It's in heaven with God as your king, with God as your father. And then look in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. Peter is kind of reaffirming the same idea here. 1 Peter chapter 1 says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the pilgrims of the diaspora in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Peter is making this statement here as not only kind of confirming what Paul is saying. Paul is saying our citizenship is in heaven. Peter's telling us we're just pilgrims, and pilgrims are like wanderers. They're just kind of, they go from place to place, back and forth. And the idea, I think, behind this word pilgrim that Peter's using is don't get too attached to your country. Don't get too attached to the things that are physical in nature, the physical world. Don't worry about that as much as you probably do, because you're just here for a short time. And what did Paul say? Your citizenship is not in this world; it's in heaven. So we need to remember that. And look in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. Paul again is writing, says, now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. So he's reaffirming where our citizenship lies. If we're in the citizens of the United States of America and our government is whoever wins the election wins, that's all well and good. But for me and for you, if you're a Christian, you're looking up to heaven. You're a pilgrim in this country. You're not really supposed to be attached to whatever's going on in this country so much as you should be focused on what's going on in heaven. And we sing a song, it's "This World Is Not My Home, I'm Just a Passing Through." Do we really believe that song when we sing it? Because if we really believe what that song is, all the other things in this life that go on, whoever wins the election, whoever is in charge of whatever, that shouldn't bother us as much as anything else really, because our citizenship is not part of this world. And if we find ourselves in a situation where we're really, really attached to our government, we're really, really attached to the idea behind our citizenship being Americans, it can lead us to a couple of things that would not be good for our lives. Number one, it can lead us to be unfruitful Christians. Look at Luke chapter 8, verse 14. It says, now the ones that fell among thorns are those who, when they have heard, go out and are choked with cares, riches, and pleasures of life, and bring no fruit to maturity. And that's not talking about government in general, but that's talking about the pleasures of life. That's talking about the physical realm. If we're attached to those things that are in the physical realm, we can be considered among the thorns, and that can choke the life out of our spiritual well-being if we focus too much on the things that are not as important, if you will, is going and serving God. And that's the idea there. You've got to stay focused on serving God and not letting those other things bother you, so that don't let them choke out your spirit. It also can leave you unprepared for the coming of Christ. Look at Luke chapter 21, verse 34. And remember, this is dealing with the attachment to worldly things. Luke chapter 21, verse 34. It says, "Take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly." And Luke is talking or writing what Jesus is saying. He's saying, be careful. There's all kinds of things that you can be occupied with in your mind. I mean, you can be occupied with sports. You can be occupied with your family. You can be occupied with work. You can be occupied with the election. You can be occupied with all these things. And Jesus is telling you, take heed that your hearts don't be weighed down with those things. And he mentions drunkenness and carousing and all those things. But he also talks about the cares of life. And that's what we want to look at. The cares of life are everything that we care about. And you don't have to be living in sin. You don't have to be doing all these other things. But if all those other things that they're just important to you pull you away and weigh you down, and just he tells you that the day when Christ comes and returns to get the saints, you can be unprepared for that if you allow your life to focus on the things that are not as important, the physical realm of life. So we have to be careful with that. So we also need to look at this as John is telling us to guard against the worldly things of life. In 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, he says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not in the Father, but is of the world." So John is all these things are reaffirming what we need to think about. When we're thinking about this country, we're thinking about our citizenship, thinking about our family. All that stuff is important to us, but we've got to find some way to separate and prioritize what's more important. The election coming up is a big deal, but is it the most important deal in our lives? It's really not. So we need to reaffirm our heavenly citizenship when we're thinking about after the election is over. Number 3, we need to refocus on what our mission is. And our mission in the life is, when we talk about in the idea of a mission, I think about one of the religious groups that are very mission-oriented are the Mormons. I mean, they're very mission-oriented. If you're a certain age, you have to spend 2 years of your life on a mission, going about trying to teach and trying to convert people to Mormonism. That's the idea behind what your mission is. And as Christians, are we that focused on what our mission is? Not necessarily. I'm not out there saying that you should go spend 2 years of your life on the road trying to convert people. But in reality, that's what our job is. Our job is to try to get people to Christ. Our job is to try to focus on bringing others in. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God." Your first mission in life is seeking the kingdom first. It's not football. It's not basketball. It's not family. It's seeking the kingdom of God. And then all of these other things, all the blessings that he was talking about in those passages, those things will be added to us if we're seeking the kingdom first. So we need to remember that part of our mission is there. The other thing that's a part of our primary goal is to proclaim praise and mercy for God. Look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Now, I know some of us have different personalities. Some of us, it's a lot easier to go up and talk to somebody and talk about what you did at church today, and you talk about someone's salvation and talk about those things. Then there are others of us who are more introverted and who have a harder time. It's a challenge to kind of put ourselves out there and talk about these things. And that's one of the challenges that myself, I'm not a real big spotlight person. And I don't like for people to just kind of nudge and poke and try to break apart what I'm trying to say. So that's the challenge that I have to face and to work through just to do what Peter is telling me to do here. To go out and proclaim all the praises of Him who called you. That's what we do. And even if you have an extroverted personality, you still have challenges to face. But introverts have challenges as well. To put ourselves out there and make sure that we're doing this as our mission. I think sometimes whenever we think about the Great Commission, Jesus said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel." When we think about all the world, this is just the way that my mind looks at how I've seen things go. We see the church in India is growing, the church in China is growing, the church in America. What's it doing? Is it growing? Not really. So when we think about our mission in life, the United States is as much of a mission field as China, South Pittsburgh, Bridgeport, Kimball, Chattanooga. There are places in this country who don't have congregations of the church. There are people in this town who have never heard of the Church of Christ. And that's our job, to make sure that those people know that, about what we are and what we do, and why it would be more beneficial for you to study the Bible and look at what the church is. And I think Christians forget about that. But we have as much opportunity to talk to our neighbor, to talk to people at work about what the church is, and be part of that mission-mindedness. And if we all did that, if we all took part in that, then guess what the church will do? The church in China will grow, the church in India will grow, and the church in the United States of America will grow. I mean, it can't not grow. It has to. So whenever I'm thinking about this, whenever we kind of compare our evangelistic efforts with our political talk, where do we rate? What's it fit on the scale? Do we spend more time talking about politics or about Jesus? I think I'm guilty as politics or football or whatever, because there's things that are easier to talk to and talk about than talking about the church. And so we need to remember what our primary mission in life is whenever we think about what happens after the election. And number 4, we need to make sure that we give our leaders their due. We need to make sure that we're submitting to our leaders. And we read Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 4 just a few minutes ago, and that talks about the authority being the governing authority coming from God, and if we don't submit to that authority, then we're opening up a can of worms for ourselves. But look at 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 50. I want John, I want Peter. Okay, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. He says, and we'll start in verse 12. But these, like natural brute beasts, made to be caught and destroyed, speak evil of the things that they do not understand, and will utterly perish for their own corruption, and receive the wages of unrighteousness. And all those who count it pleasure to carouse in the daytime, they are the spots and the blemishes, carousing in their own deceptions while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery. That doesn't sound right. And they cannot cease to sin, enticing unstable souls. They have a heart trained in covetous practices and are accursed children. They have forsaken the right way and gone astray. I don't think I wrote the right verse down. But anyway, the idea behind that is you have to submit to what the government wants you to do, whether it's the speed limit laws. Those are just as important as, don't kill people. How you treat each other, how you look at the government and the laws in general. Those are, and I know sometimes we look at some of the laws and like, well, it's not really a big deal if I'm going 75 and a 70. Not really a big deal if I just, take this little bit of food here because I'm really hungry. Those things are things the government says not to do. And as Christians, we need to make sure that we're not doing those things that the government is telling us not to do. We owe them our respect and our submission. And we do this for the sake of our conscience. And if we do this, if we're not following the rules and following the laws of the government as a Christian, think about what that does to the church as a whole. If we're out there and we're proclaiming ourselves to be members of the church and Christians, and we're out there stealing, what's it do to the rest of the body? Well, the rest of the body is hurt by our actions. So we need to make sure that we're being submissive to what our government wants us to do, unless there's one exception. They're asking us to do something that's not right. We owe our government our taxes and revenue. I remember what Jesus said whenever he pulls the coin out of the fish's mouth, and they're trying to trick him and to get him to say something that he doesn't need to say. And what's he say? Whose picture's on that coin? Well, of course it was Caesar's picture. Then he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So we owe our government certain things. We also owe our government respect and honor. And we do this by not speaking evil to those who are in authority. We owe our government our prayers. And I appreciated the Bill's prayer this morning because it tied perfectly with what we're talking about. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, 1 Timothy chapter 2. Therefore I exhort first all the supplication, prayers, intercessions, and giving thanks being made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead quiet, peaceful. He tells us what we should pray for. Just pray for them, but also pray that we might lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. So when we're making our prayers to our government, we can pray for them, pray for that they do things the right way, but also pray that they can allow our country to be in a situation where we can live our lives like we need to live them, to be pleasing to God. And I think that's what Paul is dealing with. So we need to remember to give our leaders their due. And we're running out of time. So quickly, the last thing we want to talk about is after the election is over, we need to resume our roles as peacemakers. And the idea of a peacemaker is something, why should we be peacemakers? Why do I need to be a peacemaker? Well, it's because Christ is the Prince of Peace. It's because we're servants of Christ. And in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 13 through 18, and we won't go there for lack of time, but he's talking about Christ is dying to make peace between people. Peace between us. So since he's peacemaker, he was the peacemaker, the Prince of Peace, we should also be peacemakers as well. And remember Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for what? They shall see God, be called sons of God. So as we're going through this election season, whoever it is that your candidate is, and if they win, that's great. If they don't, that's great. But just remember that there are some things that we need to focus our attention on. Remember, God's in control. Our citizenship is in heaven. Our leaders are to be given respect. We need to be peacemakers, and we need to make sure that we're focused on our mission of serving God. If there's anyone here this morning who's not a Christian, then maybe you might want to think about where your citizenship is. Do you put more stock in the citizenship of the United States or in the citizenship of heaven? And I'm sure most people know what the plan of salvation is. You know, Jesus tells us to believe that he is the Son of God. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, then the song is prepared, and it's, why wait? There's no better time than now. And if you are a Christian and you've gotten your priorities out of whack, what better time than now is to rededicate and reaffirm your citizenship to the heavenly host. If you have a need, we ask that you come as we stand and sing this song.